Hello, my name is Jorb. I love gear. I'm sitting in front of the Vector. The Vector, or Vector, this is a 16-voice digital synthesizer. Comes from a group of just two people, Andre and Adam. They very kindly sent this over about a year ago, and there was no hard deadline, and they aren't paying me for anything. Other pieces of gear came up and went, and you know how it goes. Things get lost in the shuffle. This got lost in the shuffle for me, and its sound design works in a way that feels completely unique to me. Yes, there's some connection to like the Prophet VS, but I think those connections are mostly superficial. I think the way that the oscillators work and sort of the orbiter pathing on this works really make it entirely its own thing. No single part of it feels like any other thing I've ever used. I really, really mean that. The arpeggiator is different, the sound generation is different, the filters, the way the filters are implemented. Of course, the visual, like, orbiter screen here, how that all works. It really is completely different from anything else I've ever used. That results in a little bit of friction for somebody like myself who's really ingrained in sort of traditional analog synthesis, but it doesn't really matter because the end results are so unique, and interacting with this feels so different from anything else. And it's really cool. It's really special. I've seen a few videos, but it was years ago, and after I get something, I try and not watch what anybody else has done because I'm terrified of taking their ideas, their opinions. So I've seen some other people cover this, but it must have been when it released, probably around 2 years ago. Anyway, yeah, I'm rambling. I'm going to do my sort of traditional Jorb deep dive where I explain how everything works. I will be going a little bit quicker through certain sections of this, because I know for sure if you're interested in it, you will read into it, you will go deeper. So if anything confuses you while I'm talking, I'll have a link to the manual. Skip around with the chapters below. That's all I got. Let's make some noise. Here we are on the table with the Vector. To talk about the way the Vector works, you kind of have to start with the most, like, eye-catching element, of course. So we have this shape, and on that shape, a little blue dot is moving. That is our orbiter moving along its orbit. And every time I add a note, those green dots are called suborbiters, and each of those is a sort of position in this grid, in this 4-quadrant grid, for an individual voice. And you can hear that parameters are changing, right? The parameters that are changing, you determine by each of these 4 corners. So we're focused on corner 1 on its own. Sounds like that, really high passed. Corner 2. Also pretty high passed. Corner 3. A lot louder. And corner 4. Okay. And then if I press focus one more time, we're just in the middle. And I can manually move that around. Hear how it reacts in each of those 4 corners, but if I hold that focus button, we'll go back to this mode where we're moving along a path. So there's sort of 2 modes. I don't know exactly what they're called, but one works like in LFO and one works like in envelope. So right now we're in the LFO mode where this orbiter is moving. And whenever I add suborbiters, which you can see I can change the size and speed of, dedicated controls over here. Once I add a suborbiter, it will be added around that orbiter. The other mode, if I hit this arrow, is more of like an envelope, and you see our blue dot is there, our orbiter is there. And every time I add another voice, let me tame the suborbiters a little bit. We start from that same place and move now. We start from that same place and move along our path. So, if I set us up, this is going to be great. If I set us up with an arpeggio here, let's just change through some different positions. Yes, you can move this shape around. Now you can sort of think of it like an envelope, right? And its speed is determined here. And of course, that speed works in the LFO mode as well. That is a division of our master tempo. And while we're moving along this shape, these shapes are not static. So you see this warp pad, press on it, and then start moving to the left, or moving up and down. You get very, very different shapes. This is sort of how it starts. There are tons of other shapes. When you move left and right, it's like you're spinning a 3D cylinder. When you warp up and down, it's sort of like you're bending the top and bottom of that cylinder in opposite directions. So you get some really outlandish shapes. But really, if you just trace what the suborbiter is doing, you can treat it like an envelope and shift your parameters like that. Because right now, see, over the length of one note of this arpeggio, we're crossing pretty much between three quadrants. Of course, I can stretch that to just go back and forth between two. But there really is, so even just that basic one, but there really is so much to be found with that. So anyway, I feel like you need to address that first. Hey, what's up with these fucking shapes before you talk about, normally I'd want to start with something like an oscillator, but these are just so interesting to look at, and really in a lot of ways, like if you have any, sort of preconception about the vector, you'll know that it does that. And there's tons of other shapes. So this is like a variable polygon. So if I turn up sharpness, segments down, you'll see it just jumps between these positions. Square here. So just another way of thinking of what an envelope or an LFO can be. This is modulation over time, even though it looks so visually, crazy. We have this sort of pulse wave. Change this up even more. And of course, again, change that to be whatever we want. It's almost like slicer things, how choppy that is. I'd love if I could smooth that out. And actually, what I think is the most useful, although ostensibly it might be the most boring, it's an envelope that you then position where everything goes through the grid. So if I have no attack, it'll really quickly go from A to D. If I have slow attack, it takes a long time, and then our decay stage. And then whenever you let it go, no matter where it's at in its travel, it'll drift towards the release quadrant. So let's say I want to do something like that. I think this is the most useful in a lot of scenarios. I think this is sort of the most useful because you're sort of like directly drawing the paths. Even though in all the other shapes you're doing the same thing, and this one of course can't work in an LFO mode, but it doesn't have to be just straight lines. So if I move warp, we get this sort of sinusoidal movement here. And I think that stuff like this, yeah, let's stack even more up. Can sound really, really, really rad. Longer decay stage. And then here, if I go, you press in between A and D, in between D and S. Let's sort of crank that up. Let's just move actually back in the opposite direction. Man. I'm actually going to turn down the frequency on that. But widen its sort of depth. Such a cool thing. And then sustain through release, of course, we can change just like that. And this, I think, is a lot less visually compelling than if, some of those parabolic, I guess, geometric shapes. But in terms of what you have control over and sort of the end result, I find this to be, in some cases, more useful. But even, what if we make that like a two-stage thing? So the attack to the decay and then the decay to the sustain is following that same line. Squish it up. Man, so many cool things. I'm just getting lost a little bit. But anyway, there you go. I felt like I needed to explain the shapes before anything else. Okay, and I just found a nice little setup for it now. And I'm going to go into detail now with the corners and the sort of sound generation. I think I might change the way the cameras are set up for that. So, yes. The shapes and the orbits and all that stuff, all the stuff you see on the screen most of the time is really like the marquee feature, but the sound generation is very, very deep, ignoring that sort of modulation side of things. And that's where I think you need to decide really if this makes sense for you, because this visually can be super compelling, but if the way you generate sounds isn't something that's interesting to you, then this is not really worth it. So anyway, I'm going to go to an initialized patch. Here we go. Here's our initialized patch. I'm going to put it in envelope mode just so I don't forget, and then change our focus to corner 1. Okay, so the way these corners all work, they have 2 overtone generators. They're blended in a specific way, and they may or may not have a filter on them. We'll talk about that later, but I'm going to open this filter cutoff all the way open just in case. If I hit corner matrix, this is where a lot of that stuff is really getting configured. Generators here, filters here. So let's start. I'm going to turn the prime slot off for everybody. I'll explain that in a sec. Generator 1. So with nothing else going on, we're just going to listen to all the overtone generators in order. And you'll see on this little table I'm going to pull up, we have even and odd harmonics. And so A, B, and C are all even. That's a sawtooth, baby. So is this kinda. More of a square. They're interesting shapes. D, E, F. And N is noisy. But still pitched in some ways. And so, if we look at our blend control here, in the middle, it's just generator 1. At the left, they're mixed together. Of course, when you add the same ones together, they get really, really loud. That sounds sort of like a pulse widthy thing. And then with noise, if I just want that sawtooth with a little bit of noise, that's C plus N, only a little bit to the left here past the middle. Of course, we can change their relative tuning. So if I change all of the generator 2s, even though we're just listening to corner 1 right now, to 1 octave below, and then I go back to the mix, and I put this on. Or I can make it 2 octaves below. Or I think, what is 1/3? Is that an octave and a fifth? And what was 1/5? Is that 2 octaves and a third? Doesn't matter, but 1 octave down, 2 octaves down. Somewhere in between. Okay, you can get a lot of sounds that way. I don't find it intuitive really at all. I just kind of mess around until I land on something that sounds interesting. What is very, very interesting is the different blend modes. And so these all affect past this 50% mark on this overtone blend control here, right? And so we have phase modulation, which is pretty much FM. I'm actually going to get this back into being in the same octave here. You can think of PM as AM. You can think of PM as FM. Phase modulation is effectively frequency modulation. Certainly when you hear it, that's very FM-y. And if I change the overtone generator, almost Formanty stuff without doing any Formanty stuff. Sort of the same effect as doing like through 0 FM. So to the left, they're mixed together. To the right, they're modulated. And this controls how they're modulated. FM, or PM, phase modulation. Amplitude modulation, you can think of that like cross mod or ring mod. With these, like, locked in pitch, same octave, it doesn't sound that interesting, but if I get it to a more interesting interval, I can really get it to do something. And noise is always going to sound interesting. Okay, we're going fast. Our third blend mode is both amplitude modulation and phase modulation. Let's get off of noise. So again, sort of FME timbres, phase distortion and amplitude modulation. I'm not super well versed on phase distortion, okay? The closest I have gotten is with the Hydrasynths. They have a mode that sort of stretches waveforms in and around, but interesting. In reverse phase distortion, this sort of changes the response curve of that phase distortion. Cool, you got all that. They have individual volume levels for each of the corners. You can apply a limiter. I like to have those on. And the prime slot, you can introduce the fundamental frequency as a sine wave at any point in the chain. So you see this is sort of our signal path. We have generator 1 and 2 who come together in the blend. And after that blend, so the result of that blend is this mix. And so you can add a sine wave of whatever it is you're playing to any of these steps. Add some low end, thickens things out, and sort of changes the results of a lot of these other blend modes. What if I want to add it to the blend? So right now we're mixing generator 1, generator 2 together before whatever's happening here with the blend mode. Here it's after. Or, of course, turn that sort of prime slot, that fundamental frequency off. So, unique. I love that it's different. I love that it's sort of flexible in a way that nothing else I've ever really used has been. But it's not fun to do that 4 times. It's not fun to try all those things 4 times and settle on what you want for the corners. They sort of seem to realize that it takes a long time. And so we have these randomization options here. If you see these dice, I can, and you see these dotted line, it's just these 5 options here. But I can just do randomize the corners, randomize the matrix, or randomize both. Okay, so if I just randomize the selected corners, so just one, and I hit the dice, see, it just changes these parameters down here. Okay, and if I hit just the matrix, and I'm still on 1, it'll change every one of these settings up in here for just 1. If I do both, it'll randomize it completely. Great. Oh my gosh, I didn't even talk about the filters. So the way the filters work, they're not necessarily tied to a corner. You have 4 filters you can assign wherever you'd like. Does randomize change these? Yes, it does. You can assign these 4 filters wherever it is you'd like. Okay, so I can have filter 1, filter 2, filter 3, and filter 4 all be on one corner, and I can have all of them be at a single step in the signal path. So if I want filter 1, 2, 3, and 4 all on just generator 1 before anything else for corner 1, I can do that. And each of the filters can be different. High pass, band pass, low pass, 12 dB or 24 dB. That's 2-pole or 4-pole, or this format filter. So to show off the filters, I'm actually going to get everything to the same mode here. And you can see I got out of focus mode, and now when I move these knobs, all 4 corners options are shifting. I'm going to move them all together. And see this when they're all variable as well, they'll move together. If I turn it up really far, then they'll all line up. The filter's going to be all the way open for now. It can be just on generator 1. Best way for me to find exactly the spot where it's just generator 1 is I turn on the noise. When I can't hear the noise anymore. Then I've settled on it. I'm going to turn the resonance all the way down here. And so I'm going to change filter 1 to be all the way here at the end of the mix. Actually, I'm going to go back and focus. Just on 1. So, we'll get there. High pass filter. That's what you expect. Band pass. That's what you expect. The 2 low passes. They do sound pretty good. And then this only one that really requires its own bit of explanation is this format filter. It reminds me in the nicest way of that VST with the monk. So if I set up on our different corners, different settings for our filter cutoff, and different settings for our filter resonance, and then I go out of focus mode, enter the quarter matrix, speed this up. You hear it moving around, right? And since they're all in different modes, okay, the way this works, they're not tied to the corners. They're tied to whatever you want. It makes the most sense to me most of the time to have each of them be here on the blend after oscillator mix. And sort of the one you hear for a given moment is wherever you've assigned it here. So another reminder then, the filters are not tied to the corners. It makes the most sense for them to be in a lot of cases. But if you just want, if you just want the unresolved sort of result of one corner to come out, you could totally do that. And a lot of the times, the way the overtones work, it might sound high-passed already, especially if you aren't using the prime slot, etc., etc. Okay, so I'm going fast because I can tell if you're into this, if you care about this, you'll learn about it. But I just want to show you, hey, look at all this crazy, crazy shit that you could be setting up on here. But in the end, I find that I want to just hit random until something sounds cool. And then do a lot of my like sound design stuff after that, like deciding, you know what, this sounds weird because of the way these are all tuned. I'm going to lock all these. Or say, okay, I want something to change when I hit now. After feeling it out and having something moving that involves the shapes, that involves some established generators already, I want it to change a little bit more when I get towards corner 3. So then I change the tuning. all that stuff. And incorporating all of the different elements together are kind of where this becomes what it is. And also, used subtly is probably the best way most of these things are implemented. Of course, we've got effects afterward, very simple reverb, chorus, and delay. And a traditional amp envelope. And I find myself doing open pads a lot. And ending up with somewhat similar sounds. But that might just be me. And also, important to remember, you don't have to use every corner on every patch. Certainly not, in equal doses. If you just have your shape over here, it's less visually impressive because it's taking up less of your screen or whatever. But maybe that turns out to be the sound I like. So there you go. Insanely powerful. And intimidating in a way that not a lot of stuff is. If you aren't open to reading the manual and you want to learn the sound engine, through and through, it's not going to happen. You need the manual to understand this, I believe. I never would have known what the prime slot was as much as I was experimenting because there's so many other things that might be affecting it. For example, or necessarily how the filter works, or even something as small as when you hit random, make sure you follow those dots. Like, there's a lot of little user interface things that make this sort of hard to approach without the manual. But the end result is something that's unbelievably unique. To explore modulation in a geometric domain is really, really unique. Okay, right now, there's another example. I randomized it a few times. What do I want to change? I want the filters to have more of an effect. So filter 1, 2, 3, 4, all over the blends. And I want them all to be different low-pass filters. Even lower. I really want to dampen this. So let's get everybody onto 4-pole filters. Let's actually put filter 1 on the mix of the whole thing. That's more what I was thinking. Turn up some drive. I will say, the drive sounds good. Anyway, I find it hard to approach the vector in a structured way because everything touches everything else. And I want to talk about it as soon as it comes up. So I think I've done a good enough job of hey, you got to start with the shapes. That's what everybody sees. That's what everybody knows. Then, hey, the Overtone generators are complicated. They do a lot. They're flexible in a way that a lot of people probably don't realize. And I feel like we've done a lot already, and it's already I have a half understanding of so many of these things, and there's even more. I'm splicing this together a little bit later. Let me summarize all the stuff I just talked about. I think the visual components, the suborbiters, the orbiters, all this sort of interacting with shapes here is the most important, the most unique, and the most engaging part of using the vector. And I think that the Overtone generators get you very, very interesting results and interact with the shapes, with the modulation in a really fascinating way. But the generators are still kind of uninviting to set up and manipulate. They're extremely configurable. They're very flexible. And I think the blend modes are the most interesting thing. Everything past 50% on our Overtone blend is where a lot of the uniqueness can be found. But I still, bottom line, I think they're a little bit uninviting. That being said, it's kind of essential to the way Vector ends up sounding. And even if somebody like me might prefer a normal oscillator, a waveform, and a waveform mod, you know, pulse width or things like that, I think the Vector sounds and reacts the way it does because the sound generation works like that. Very, very cool, very, very special. After all the sound generation, there's so much more that we really need to touch on. Okay, let's talk about the arpeggiator. So we can see a lot of the settings once we come in here, and it works the way you'd expect. See, I have this switch active, and feed is flashing on both or the arpeggiator. I can hold notes, and it'll repeat them. That's our hold, our keyboard hold. So if I just press, then it goes. Wow, that autofocus is actually working. This is the first time in my life I've had a camera that can do autofocus. And then we can sort of change that pattern. I guess you can already see these are giving us different octaves. And these faders down here are velocity. So let me make that really dramatic. In the mod matrix there, I can make velocity have a huge effect on what we hear. Cool. I'm going to change it back up so I don't forget. And we can have it rise, fall, shuffle. Nothing on is as played. If I do record here, I can plug my notes in one at a time. See, it says 15 on that now. I'm really trusting autofocus, guys. I'm not used to trusting autofocus. And then these same controls, of course, will work with what I put that way. And then the way feed works, if I turn it off, so it's just a solid light, it's not flashing, I can play along with whatever we put in. Which is a pretty cool feature. What I don't really get about feed, it also works for the delay. So you just kind of get an extra step for what should be kind of like expected behavior. So delay is on, feed is on. The delay is working. If I turn off feed, it stops. I like that feature, especially for the ARP. It's also cool for the delay. But for the delay, the only real use I can think of, and I think somebody else did this in a video. It's been years since I watched them, so I don't remember who. But feed on, feed off, and then that'll just go while feedback's all the way up. And you can kind of treat it like a looper. And do shit like that. I can understand like wanting to use feed just for the ARP, but I think it just working for the arpeggiator would be enough. And now it feels like we spent a lot of hardware real estate on that. I think that's everything for the arpeggiator. It can have a separate speed to your orbiters or everything else. It's all still related to the master clock, though, which you can set down here, or BPM. Of course, set it over MIDI. This will randomize. I should show you this. This will randomize the octaves every time it goes through, and this will randomize ties. And if I didn't show you ties, if you have two notes that are on the same octave, and you link them together, then it'll sort of glide between them. But I think that's it for the arpeggiator. If I get this sort of paddier again, we can listen to what has been on here the whole time, all of these other effects. So this is our mix for all the effects, and their parameters are in here. And this is a good time to mention we have this upper, lower, and auto control. So if I put it on lower, it's always the lower labels. So here it's reverb color and reverb size, no matter what screen I'm on. If I'm on upper, it's always the top. If I'm on auto, it's sort of with respect to the screen that I'm on. I like that solution. If you're ready to move between screens, you'll hardly ever want to do anything other than auto, except for a really specific moment of like, you know what, right now, I really want to make sure that I get my overtone blend right, but you don't want to leave this screen. I think if you're using this two hands, it works pretty well. But just to hear all of them in isolation, I'm going to turn down these mixer elements. Still pretty cool sound. I think the reverb's great. Kind of reminds me of a plate. We'll hang out for a really, really long time. Chorus. I think sounds good. These settings are fast or slow speed. This engages or disengages the color, which is a filter. And then this is stereo behavior or not. I'm always going to leave it on. All that's good. Let's get the delay, which you've heard. Same thing here, stereo. That's like an EQ on it, on the feedback. Sort of darkens and repeats. This lets you feed it into the buffer or not. It's really hanging out. You feel it ping-ponging. This is we've got a drive. So it's pretty good. That lets us bypass it, I think. And then over here, we've got a vibrato and a tremolo. That I think sound really, really good used subtly, because just like everything else on the Vector, it's leading to more movement. It's leading to more... Yeah, it's leading to more movement, and I know that's probably the word I'm saying, because literally, you watch things move, but it seems very in line with the sort of design philosophies at place in other parts of this, that so much of what makes a sound interesting is it changing over time, and all these effects really, really complement that. I think that might be everything. I think I might have shown you, I guess I didn't show you the voice modes, but mono lets you stack as many voices as you want and detune them. Visually, you can see I press a single key and I get all of the suborbiters at once. I think it's 16. And dual is 2 suborbiters or 2 voices for every key press. And you can detune the follower, so the second one, and the stereo spread of those 2 voices. You can always have a pair every time you hit a key. Pretty cool. I think that dual mode actually is something I should have spent more time in. There you go. I think that's a pretty comprehensive look at what this is and how it works and what it can do. So I'm just going to show you what I think is the sort of best case scenario for using it. I'm just going to find something that has a nice sound, name to it. I like whistlers, I think. I've done that one before. So if I think the best use case for the Vector is having a place where you understand on some level what's happening with the corners, and you do your sort of sound generation, your sound design, by changing the way your suborbiters or your orbiters are moving through those. So here, I like it. I want to hear more of the filters. I always do. So if I go, let's move 4 to the mix of everything, and we'll make it 4-pole. That's already the sort of thing I was looking for. I'm not hearing everything I want to out of corner 2. So I listen. Get it somewhere else. Now it's a little shrill. Go to generators. Generator 1, tune. an octave lower, and then I get out of focus. And sort of manipulating sounds like that, and like this, and through the screen, that is the most interesting part of this. I think that's where this really shines. I think that's the best way to use the vector. And whether it is, you know, corners you have set up yourself, and then you say, you know what, I want to use an ADSR instead. So even right there, I want to flip these around. Reducing the effect of that by literally pulling it away from that corner. Okay, I want it to be a little bit brighter. I think that and this sort of interaction, this sort of, you know, back and forth of, oh, I hear that, I want to change it. I think this, interacting with the vector on this screen, is far and away the most engaging part of it. And getting to a place where you know what's happening in the corners, you can kind of manipulate and feel towards a sound that way. That's when this feels like really, really unique, really, really special. I mentioned some very minor user interface complaints, but overall, this feels really, really good to sit and use once you get over the hump of, you know, understanding the sort of navigation stuff. And I do still think the generators are uninviting, but that's because they can be so flexible. That's because they can end up being so much. And this sounds the way it does entirely because of that. So I don't think you can pull that out and this still have the sort of identity that it does. There you go. I honestly think the Vector is special, and the guys who made it are great, and they take a lot of good feedback and all that. This is a cool thing to be coming out right now. Like I say all the time, I'm happy instruments like this are coming out. I'm happy people are working hard and doing cool shit like this, because I like interacting with stuff that feels so different, so inspired. But still definitely not for everybody. But for the people it's for, goddamn is it really for. So there you go. My name's Jorb. I love gear that really includes the Vector. Thanks for watching. Cheers and so long.